Hi, my name is Sean Olson, and this is Wallworm on the Grid. In this video, I'm going to cover most of the things you'll ever need to know about the Grid in 3ds Max as it relates to the source engine. I'm going to talk about the Grid in relation to the Grid and Hammer in 3ds Max. And we're going to dispel a lot of myths, because there are a lot of them out there about the Grid in 3ds Max. The source engine world has for a long time misunderstood the 3ds Max Grid, especially from the level design perspective. And this video will help you get up to speed and understand the real way that the grid works in 3ds Max. Now, to successfully use the grid in Max, you need to first set up your system units to match those in the source engine. You can do that under the Customize menu and go to the Unit Setup. Make sure that you're using generic units, and make sure that your system units is such that one unit equals 1 inch. At this point, your system units will match those inside of Hammer. The next thing we want to do is set up our home grid. Now, the home grid is, in the perspective viewport, this grid that we see here. By default, it's really not set up to how we want it for Source Engine. In fact, you'll notice down here at the bottom, there's a current grid spacing setting, grid equals 10. We don't want 10. We can do that by clicking this snaps toggle. We need to right click it, and it brings up this grid and snap settings menu. We go to the home grid tab, and here we want to change the grid spacing to something more conducive of our level design goals. You can choose any value as long as it's a power of 2, and we're going to use to start with the value of 64. And if I tab off of this, you'll see that the grid spacing increased. The next thing I'll want to do is set the major lines every nth grid line to something that is also a power of 2. In this case, I'm going to do 8. We did not see any change in the viewport because the other setting here, perspective view grid extent, is only set to 7. We haven't even passed 8 yet. So we'll go up to 8 and go past that. You'll notice that there are different colors in the lines. Now, depending on your driver, video card drivers, and depending on your system colors, you may not actually see those very well. In this case, I can't even see them with my current color setting. The next thing I'm going to explain is that the grid is adaptive, and that means if I uncheck this option here, inhibit perspective view grid resize, that the grid will actually grow and shrink based on the current distance of the viewport from the grid. And you'll also notice that as we zoom out, the grid may actually change its scale, and there we saw it happen, and it changed such that the current grid spacing you see down here is 512 because it adapted to the size, because the grid unit at this distance that I had at 64 was just way too small to use. But as we get closer, and you can see, and here you can probably see in the recording that there's a slightly grayer line here, and this relates to the major lines every 8 segments here. Now, if I didn't want this to change, if I re-click this option here, then the extent of it won't change. But as we zoom out, it will always change to something that is more visible to work with. However, notice as we zoom in, it's not doing that. If we do want it to adapt to zooming in, we turn off this inhibit grid subdivision below grid spacing, and then you'll notice that even as we go in, the grid will further subdivide as we zoom in. So this helps you as you're working with smaller units. And notice here that the grid is currently at 0.125, which is not something you normally want when working with the source engine. So in this case, here's the minimum we want to go. If we wanted to keep it such that it always goes down to 1 and never goes below that, we can set this grid spacing to 1, but we want to turn on the inhibit grid subdivision below the grid spacing. So now 1 will be the minimum that we see. So no matter what, no matter how far away we are, we'll always have a power of 2 grid spacing. However, at this point, it will never go below 1. So this is for your adaptive navigation of the grid, if you want it to just kind of accommodate you as you're working. Now I'm going to go back to more of a standard hammer-like setup. So we're going to go to a 64 unit, and we're going to turn off all of these adaptive updating. And we're going to discuss how you can specifically set the grid on the fly with shortcut keys, because that's something that's common in Hammer. So currently my grid spacing is set to 64. If I want to just double that or half it based off of my current needs and manually do it, you can set up some hotkeys to do that as long as you have Wallworm installed. Wallworm comes with some macro scripts that will do this for you. So you'll want to go to Customize User Interface. You want to go to the Keyboard tab, wallworm.com, and you'll find that there are some options in here. Decrease grid spacing will cut the grid spacing in half, and increase grid spacing will double it, just like it would in Hammer. And you assign your own shortcut key. In this case, I have it to shift bracket and shift bracket for the two. So what this means is I'm hitting the keyboard and I'm having the grid spacing right now, or I'm doubling it. It's the same way it works in Hammer. So far I've been explaining to you the UI of controlling the grid, but we haven't actually used it yet. Now there are a couple of factors that you have to keep in mind with the grid in 3ds Max. First of all, there are more complex sets of ways to work with the grid. There are 3D snaps 2.5 and 2. Here's the thing to remember. For the perspective viewport, you always want to use the 3D snaps. However, in orthographic views like front, top, left, or any other orthographic projection, you'll want to stay on 2 or 2.5. A lot of times for the level design, you'll actually want to stay with 2.5 if you're moving things around. If you're just doing layout plans, you may want to stick on 2, but make sure that your grid plane is where you want it. We're going to stay in the perspective view for now, so I'm going to stay on the 3D snaps. Now, I have snaps on. If I make a box here, it's not snapping to the grid. It's just completely random. And that is because I don't have which snaps I want turned on. In this case, I don't have snap to grid on. Now, let's delete this box. If I go to create it, you'll notice that the cursor has this little yellow icon that designates where it's going to snap to. And currently I only have snap to grid on, so as I get close to a grid point, it's going to just snap to that point. So at this point, this box, because I use snap to grid, every single vertex on this box is aligned to the grid 100%, identically to how it would be in Hammer had you made this box. There is no difference. They are on the grid. Every point is. And we can see this by going to the editable poly, go to vertex sub-element mode, to the vertex sub-object mode, hit W to show our translation, and you'll notice down here in the bottom these points are 100% aligned to the grid. There's no fractional values. So if you want to stay aligned to the grid, make sure that as you're creating what becomes your world geometry, that you have snap to grid on. Now this covers making basic objects like brushes in a Hammer style method where everything is made one block at a time. In this case, all of these boxes here could designate the outline of a wall and a building and of course a crate. If we export this into source, every one of these vertexes, again, all of these will be aligned to the grid exactly as it would be in Hammer. However, building things in this fashion is really not the best way to utilize the power of 3ds Max, so you'll want to learn some of the other tools in Max. I'm going to cover a couple more points about how grids and snaps work together. In this case, say this is a crate and I want to move it to another location and keep it on the grid. Okay, all you have to do is make sure that when you hover over your cursor and your translation gizmo is letting you it shows you the snap icon where I'm snapping to. So if I hover over this and it shows the snap icon and the translation cursor, this means that when I grab it, it's going to be from that grid point. And now as I move it, I can snap it exactly to any other grid point. It's going to be back on the grid, 100%. Now, I'm going to show you how to fix a problem if you happen to have accidentally moved it off the grid. In this case, I'm going to move it some random distance off the grid. I can still get this object and move it back on the grid by turning on the Snap to Vertex toggle. And now I'm grabbing that vertex, and now I'm snapping it back to the grid. I can also turn off Snap to Grid, and because I know that these vertices are always on the grid because of the size that I made them, and they were already on the grid, I can actually grab this vertex here and snap it up here, and I know that this object is going to be on the grid. And another example of this, say we want to copy this to this corner over here and make sure it's aligned to the grid. In that case, I'm going to shift drag it and snap it, and this object is now exactly snapped to that grid. And we can see this again by converting this to an editable poly, looking at any of the vertexes, and you're going to see that the values here are basically integer values. They're aligned to the grid. Now this is really easy with box-like geometry. Just like in Hammer, it's easy to keep them aligned to the grid with box-like geometry. With more complex objects, we'll use a cylinder as an example. Let's put this object right here and make this a valid brush by getting rid of all these coplanar faces. In this case, we have an object where the vertexes are not exactly aligned to the grid. Now, depending on what you're doing, if you're going to convert this into a model, it's not going to matter. But if you want to keep this as brush geometry, and especially if it's a brush that's not going to be used as a func detail, and it might be cutting up the visibility of your level, you may want to make sure that these are snapped to the grid. And the easiest way to do that is to use a modifier that you can get from Wallworm, and it's just called Snap Verts to Grid. Now that I did that, every vertex in this object is snapped to the grid. And as long as the object was overall shaped well in a valid way, it should export just fine as a brush. And let's check this. Let's go to this random point here. Notice that these are all on the grid. Go to this point. It's on the grid. This point. They're all on the grid. Every vertex in this object will be on the grid. And it's as simple as that for fixing that kind of stuff. In fact, we could even take a box like this and rotate it. I'm going to rotate it 30 degrees, and at this point, if we convert it to an editable poly, we have a problem where some of these vertexes are no longer on the grid, as you can see down here. Well, let's put a Snap Verts to Grid on here, convert it back to an editable poly, and there we go. All of these vertexes, every single one of them in the object, are back on the grid. But as mentioned earlier, the value of building your level in 3ds Max cannot be truly utilized if you're building your level entirely brush by brush as you would in Hammer. There are several tools that you have available to you that you can get from Wallworm that will help you build your levels in a more parametric manner and make you work way faster and still keep everything on the grid. In this case, I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of these. We're going to start with a plugin called Corvex. It's a geometry plugin specifically made for brushes. And when we add it to the scene, it by default is just a block here to designate that it wants you to start making it. So I'm going to say that this is actually a wall, and I want to snap to vertexes in this case, and not the grid. And I'm going to start creating this wall here. From this point to this point, and we'll say that I want it to go here to here to here. Okay, so now we have this basic wall, and I want it to go to the other side and maybe be a little thinner for demonstration purposes here, and 32 so we can see. All of the vertexes on this are probably already on the grid, but even if they're not, because sometimes with corners here, depending on the width and the angles of the walls, the outside edges may not be on the grid. Those that appeared at the vertexes that were already on the grid are going to be on the grid because we derived them from grid snapped points. But these other ones may potentially not be on the grid, but that's simple. To make sure that everything is on the grid, there's just a checkbox here. If I click this, then no matter what, every vertex in the whole object is on the grid. And it doesn't look like it even changed, because I believe this was already designed that it would have been on the grid anyway. But that's all I got to do here is click that option. And if I wanted it to snap to the 16 by 16 grid, well, in that case I would just type in 16, and now everything snapped to the 16 by 16 grid. Of course, the closest point for all of these in that case made these not valid because they're planar. But say we wanted it to be on the 4 by 4 grid, now everything is on the 4 by 4 grid. Had these walls been thicker and not so close, the 16 would have been fine. There are several geometry plugins in Max, in Wallworm, that allow you to create brushes that are 100% snapped to the grid, and you can't get them off the grid. In fact, as long as I have this checkbox here, you can't get any vertex in this whole object off the grid. The same with other types of geometry. If I create what's called a Shellvex object on this, now this has a shell around it that's a Shellvex object composed of several brushes. It cannot be off the grid as long as I have the option that's snap to grid. In fact, it was already on the grid, but in this case, we'll show you an example here. We'll make a Shellvex object from something like this. We'll remove this object from it. I paused there for a second. This object was rotated, so it needed to have its X-form reset for Shellvex to work well. So I'm going to add a terrain to this object. Well, let's rotate it actually some, so it's no longer on the grid. Reset its X-form, and now we'll add a corridor to this. And now this object, if I add an editable poly modifier on it, we can look and see that at the moment the vertexes are not going to be on the grid. You can see that the value here is off the grid. But if we go into the Shellvex object and say that we want it to be snapped to the grid, and now we add an edit poly modifier just to demonstrate this, and go to the vertexes, you're going to see that every single vertex on that object is snapped to the grid. Now this doesn't mean that you can be completely careless, because just like in Hammer, you can have things that are snapped to the grid and invalid geometry. However, this is all about explaining how the grid works inside 3ds Max. You have to get it out of your mind that somehow the grid in Max is completely different than in Hammer, because it's not. It's just that your utilization of it may be different and you have extra options inside of Max. But as long as you keep your snaps on and you're using the types of snaps like snap to grid and snap to vertex, then you're going to stay on the grid. It does take some care in making sure that those are on and are what you're using, but there's nothing keeping you from staying on the grid except your own understanding and usage of 3ds Max. Furthermore, if you do have something that gets off the grid, you do have the convenience of the snap verts to grid modifier you can get from Wallworm that helps you get back on the grid a lot faster. There are more things that you can learn about the grid in 3ds Max, but they're beyond the scope of this video. I'll link to them in some of the future I'll link to them in the documentation and in the video information. Again, my name is Sean Olson. I hope you found this video educational and helpful in understanding some of the concepts inside of 3ds Max and dealing with the grid coming from the source engine. You can learn more about me at my website, seanolson.net, and you can always get the latest wallworm tools at wallworm.com. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thank you, and have a good day.